So setting up a verbal cue has very specific steps. And these are steps that you take when you're calm and together, not in the middle of an argument or something. And the power of a verbal cue is that the two of you have agreed that there is an issue that you would like to address. This is typically a repetitive interaction that is not positive for the two of you. And you agree not only that it needs to be addressed, but also how to address it. So the very first step to setting up the verbal cue is agreeing to what the issue is. So for example, you might have a lot of fights and you escalate quickly into those fights. And you don't want to do that anymore. So you'd like to be able to stop that before you escalate. And so that would be the issue that would need to be addressed. We have too many fights and we'd like to stop them sooner. So you agree to what the issue is. You both agree. You cannot impose a verbal cue on somebody because they are by definition about both of you participating. Then you decide what the words of the cue will be and what they mean. So sometimes you might have a single word that stands for a bigger idea, or you might have a phrase. You talk about who might use this cue and in what situations to make sure that it is actually addressing the needs that you have. And then very importantly, you talk about what each partner's response is going to be to that cue. And I'll give you an example of one as I set it up here as I go through this. But part of this is just determining how you might return to the topic in the future. It's important to understand that particularly for non-ADHD partners, it's important to have a return to the topic, some future way to get back to the topic, because there's a great deal of anxiety about whether or not you will get back to a topic if you stop the conversation. So if you don't include this step, what happens is lots of times the non-ADHD or more anxious partner doesn't want to stop the conversation in this situation, and the cue doesn't work. So you try the cue and then you figure out if it works or not. So let me give you an example of how to set one up. So I talked about the issue of escalation into arguments. And my ex-partner and I had this issue on his irritability. He would get like very fired up and get very agitated is a good word for it. And so we started with the cue, which was you're starting to get agitated. And that was supposed to be something that I would use, or perhaps he would use, but probably more often I would use at the point at which it became obvious that the agitation was happening. And then the response was to be that we would both stop talking and calm ourselves both down. So we tried this at one point. He got very agitated and I said, "You're becoming agitated." And he said, "No, I'm not. No, I'm not. Why are you always critiquing me?" And got very even further agitated, which was not the intention of the cue. So at that point we said, okay, that sounded like part of the regular conversation. And it did sound like a criticism coming from me. And so we changed it to a nonsense word, which was aardvark. It's not exactly a nonsense word, but it was a word that we would never use in conversation. So at the point one of us said aardvark, then, and either one of us could, then our response was to stop talking immediately and then try to self-calm and stay in the room and stay in the conversation together. We were able to do that typically. Some couples are not, and they have to actually move away from each other and to calm down before they return to the topic. And at that point, sometimes couples will like write a note. We're talking about X, and they leave it on a kitchen counter or something so that they know to come back to it. And it's not just one partner who has to remember it. So we tried that, and aardvark actually worked. It worked quite well. And of course, neither one of you wants to use it, but it did work. Let me give you a few other examples. One is when you're in a position where, for example, you may wish to move away from white lies, cover-ups, things that happen relatively regularly in many ADHD-impacted couples where the ADHD partner does something that embarrasses them or they wish they hadn't done, and they decide to not talk about it or to cover it up or whatever, and then it comes out, or they hear themselves sort of giving a white lie, if you want to call it that, to hide something that they're ashamed of. is you're working to move away from lying. One cue that can be very helpful is at what I call a do-over cue, where you actually the partner who catches themselves in a lie, or the other partner who essentially is going, that sounds like that's not quite right. The question is, may I take a do-over, or would you like a do-over? And then the response to that is to stop, to think, take a few moments to breathe, to think, and then have the person who made the statement hopefully say yes and start over again. And the response then to the honesty is, thank you so much for sharing that with me. So there's no punishment for a do-over. Rather, there is a preset agreement that the honesty will be appreciated. And that helps open up that honesty